Okay, thank you everyone for being here. So my name is Reem. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Davis. And my main fields of research is labor and public economics with a specific focus on crime and migration. And in my job market paper, I combine these two fields together in a paper titled Violence in Mexico, Return Intentions, and the Integration of Mexican Migrants in the US. Um, Given the increase in refugees and migrants to advanced economies, there has been a lot of debate whether migrants are able to achieve full economic and cultural integration into their host societies. And this is not a new question. So there has been some seminal work by Chiswick and Borjas that shows that there is an initial large economic disparity between migrants and comparable natives. And although this gap converges over time, the rate of this convergence has been decreasing. As a result, there also has been a lot of attention on what are the factors that can influence or enhance the integration prospect. And here, predominantly, the literature has focused till now on destination-specific factors, such as the location where migrants live, whether they live in ethnic clusters, or the economic conditions at their arrival and language acquisition policies. However, we have much less evidence on the role of home country conditions, although they are likely to be relevant given that they are important determinants of the intended duration of stay of the migrant at the destination. And this in turn affects their investment in human capital that is relevant to the destination, such as language proficiency, which is also crucial for integration. And these conditions are likely to grow in relevance given that a large and increasing proportion of migrants in developed countries originate from developing countries that are often facing civil conflict, natural disasters, war, or economic crises. So in my job market paper, I fill this gap. I specifically focus on violence as a home country condition, given its growing prevalence on the globe. And I ask, how does violence in Mexico affect the integration of Mexican migrants in the United States? And I specifically focus on Mexican migrants, given that the setting will help me basically exploit variation in home country conditions at a local level in the Mexican setting, but also more so because the Mexicans constitute the largest migrant group in the US. So there are almost 11.5 million individuals who are Mexican born, and that constitutes 25% of the foreign-born population. And the literature has shown that although this population exhibits rapid convergence in employment rates, the same is not true for wages. So there are still sizable wage gaps. At the same time, the Mexican population has a persistently low naturalization and intermarriage rates, which raises questions about their cultural integration in the country. So to answer the question, I leverage the spatial and temporal variation in homicide rates. That's my main proxy for violence within Mexico. And specifically, I will be focusing on violence that ensued because of the Mexican war on drugs that occurred in the mid-2000s. And that war led to a death toll that is twice as large as that of the war in Afghanistan in its first 10 years. Now, it's important to note that there is a literature that looks at the effect of violence on international migration. However, I will be departing from that literature and specifically focusing on Mexicans who migrated to the US before the war. And that is because if I want to basically estimate the effect of violence on the integration of those who moved, then this effect will combine both the contemporaneous effect of violence as well as the effect of selection. So to shut down the selection channel, I will be only looking at a group of migrants who were in the US before the start of the war on drugs. Then I will use new administrative data on US-Mexico geographic migratory networks in order to link migrants who are in the US with their sources, which in my case is a municipio. A municipio is a municipality. And this data is provided by the Matricula Consular ID cards program, and the detail in the data, which basically provides the distribution of municipal origins of migrants across different US destinations, allows me to exploit within Mexico variation. And finally, given that the location of violence is not random within the country, but could be correlated with other socioeconomic factors, I will be using an instrumental variable approach that relies on three main components. In the first component, I will take advantage of the fact that different municipalities send migrants to different US destinations, and that basically leads to variation in migrants' municipios of origin across these destinations. And then I will exploit cross-sectional variation in the locations of drug trade organizations before the war on drugs. And that's because the war directly targeted these drug trade organizations. So in these locations where they already existed, there was a disproportionate increase in violence. And finally, to account for the time variation in violence, I will rely on Colombian cocaine supply shocks that led to a decrease in cocaine supply reaching Mexico, increasing the price of cocaine, changing rent opportunities, and leading to even more violence in areas where drug trade organizations existed. So just a quick overview on the possible channels. I will go over this in more detail towards the end of the presentation, but here I just to motivate the outcomes I look at. So violence could impact the integration of migrants who are already at the destination through two main channels. First, it could lower the intentions of migrants to return back to Mexico, and that might incentivize them to invest in destination-specific skills such as language and form social roots. At the same time, often migrants have family members back home, in this case in Mexico, and the family members could directly endure the consequences of violence. So in this case, there are two sub-channels that could act on the same outcomes in opposite direction. Migrants could either enhance their skills and labor productivity to increase remittances, some more remittances, and compensate financially for their families' losses, or the psychological distress from the adverse conditions and their home country could hinder their economic integration and productivity. So motivated by these channels, I will be exploring different measures of integration. I will use naturalization as a proxy for civil integration. And by naturalization, I mean the formal process through which a foreign-born migrant in the US becomes a US citizen. And that has implications on their access to formal labor markets and home ownership. And then as a proxy for cultural integration, I will be looking at intermarriage rates. I will also explore outcomes related to economic integration and human capital accumulation. So a quick preview of results. I find that violence in migrant source regions increases their propensity to naturalize and marry US citizens. This effect is larger for recent and low-educated migrants. And in areas where the networks are concentrated, where information is easily transmitted between migrants from the same municipality of origin. However, I find no evidence of changes in intermarriage rates. So the increase in marriage to US citizens is mainly driven by an increase in marriage to Mexican-born naturalized citizens rather than to marriage to US citizens. And I also find no evidence of changes in labor market outcomes or human capital accumulation, which could indicate that the two channels that affect these outcomes are acting in opposite directions, leading to these null effects. And finally, I argue that the effects are driven by a decline in the intentions of migrants to return back to Mexico. I supplement this mechanism with analysis using the Mexican census, which shows that there is a decrease in return migration flows in areas with heightened violence. So in terms of literature and contribution, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this due to the limited time, but the paper mainly contributes to the literature on the economic and social integration of migrants in host societies. And as I mentioned, this literature is mainly focused on destination-specific factors and policies. There is a sparse literature, however, on home country macroeconomic conditions. And this literature does is that it exploits fluctuations in inflation, exchange rates, or GDP across different countries of origin of migrants. And the main channel here is that these macroeconomic conditions could impact migrants through a change in purchasing power, relative purchasing power in the destination versus the origin. What is new in my paper is that I identify the impact of violence that ensued due to a war on drugs in the home country. And instead of leveraging variation across different countries of origin, I explored variation within Mexico, which is important for two main reasons. So first, I provide more precise estimates of localized home country shocks. And second, it's important given that oftentimes migrants react more to areas where they have more connection, and that's at a more local level than an aggregate country conditions, for instance. And finally, I use the matricula consular in a novel manner, which emphasized the role of networks in the international diffusion of shocks. And this contributes to a growing literature, and a recent one, that uses the matricula consular to estimate shocks in the opposite direction. So shocks happening in the US on outcomes of migrants back in Mexico. This paper also adds to the literature studying the interaction between return intentions, the permanency of migration, and migrant behavior. And what this literature mainly does is compare between the behavior of temporary migrants and permanent migrants. And usually permanent migrants, in the case of the US, for instance, in the paper of Cortez, are refugees who have no option whether to stay or to leave back home. I differ from that literature by focusing on temporary non-refugee economic migrants. That's typical of Mexican migrants. And I show that they still respond to home country violence shocks in terms of their return intentions. And finally, the paper broadly contributes to a literature that studies the impacts of violence on individuals residing in Mexico. And that paper shows negative effects on birth outcomes, employment outcomes, wages, and plant level output. I differ from that literature by examining spillover effects on Mexicans outside Mexico. And I also have a part of the paper that explores the return migratory effects, which adds to a large literature that looks at the immigration effects of violence in Mexico. Okay, so a quick overview of the context of Mexico. So basically the geography of Mexico, its proximity to the US, which is the largest consumer of cocaine in the world, and weak institutions created significant financial incentives for drug trade organizations to grow in the country. So between the 1980s and the 1990s, the government was mostly in control, and the drug trade organizations, which I would refer to as DTOs, were in their formative stages, trying to get more land and power. By the 2000s, the government starts losing control. The DTOs start fragmenting, disputing over power and land. And at the time, the main anti-drug policy of the government was crop eradication programs, which were not very successful. So by 2006, which is the last year before the war on drugs, there were 5 major DTOs controlling the drug market in Mexico. And while these DTOs produced drugs, the majority of their profits in that period came from drug trafficking, especially of cocaine. So this is very important later on for my IV, but by the 1990s, 88% of the cocaine that was reaching the US was doing so through the US-Mexico border. Now, what happened in December 2006 is that President Calderon from the National Action Party unexpectedly declared the war on drugs. And that was unanticipated because Calderon won the election at a very slim margin and did not make anti-drug or combating drug trafficking a main centerpiece of his campaign. So the primary goal of the administration was to confront the drug cartels, which they achieved through, one, eradicating drug crops, confiscating drugs, but more importantly, a strategy called the Kingpin strategy, which means capturing, incarcerating, and neutralizing major cartel leaders. So over the 6 years, Calderon arrested 25 crucial cartel leaders and extradited a peak of almost 600 criminal suspects to the US. And the war on drugs then saw a huge spike in violence after 2007. So here I show the homicide rate in Mexico, and before 2007, it was relatively stable. It was not very low, it was relatively stable. And then after 2007, with the war on drugs, there's this spike up until 2011 by almost 150% increase. Following that, there's a change in administration that changes the security strategy. So there is a decrease for a couple of years, but it's very temporary. Then the last administration was also focused on confronting drug cartels. So there is, again, an increase. However, in my paper, I argue that I am able to basically understand or identify more exogenously the reasons of the violence in the initial period, in the period where Calderon was a president, between 2006 and 2007. So the increase here in violence was more sudden and unanticipated. So I will be focusing on this period in my analysis. Another feature of the violence is the wide geographic and temporal variation. So in 2006, a very small number of municipios in Mexico had violence, and it was at low levels. Then by 2008, we see an increase starting in the north. By 2010, it's spreading to areas that were not violent before. That continues till 2012. Okay, so in terms of data, as is obvious by now, my main measure of violence is homicide rates per 100,000 persons in a municipio and a year. In order to obtain that data, I obtained the death certificates, the universe of death certificates in Mexico from INEGI. And these death certificates include the cause of death and some characteristics of the person who died. So then I focus on all cases where the cause of death was recorded as a homicide. Then to turn that into a homicide rate, I obtain population data from the Mexican census of population and housing. Why I use homicide rates rather than another form or another measure of violence is because homicide rates have the lowest concern of underreporting. So it is very hard to conceal a body. And that's why the underreporting concern is minimized in this case. Another advantage is that there is a consistent classification of homicides across different municipios. So we are sure that differences in geography or in spatial locations are due to violence rather than due to classifications. However, there is a strong correlation among all crimes committed within the same locality. So my primary focus is to capture the overall crime environment of fear and safety perceptions in a municipio. And the homicide rate is correlated with these perceptions. So in order to measure the outcomes of migrants, I resort to the American Community Survey, and that's an individual level cross-section. It's a repeated cross-section survey, but the data is at the individual level. As I mentioned, I have different measures of integration, such as naturalization. For intermarriage, I look at that by citizenship and origin. And then I have different measures of human capital accumulation, such as school enrollment, English proficiency, and I have some measures of labor market outcomes. As for the sample, I only look at non-institutionalized working-age Mexican-born individuals who migrated before the war on drugs, so between 2000 and 2006, and that's to shut down the selection channel, as I mentioned at the beginning. But then I also do further restrictions for the commuting zones. So I look at commuting zones with above median Mexican population that are balanced every year. The idea here is that I wanted to focus on commuting zones where networks already existed, that were already a destination for Mexican migrants in the US. So I'm left with 345 out of 740 commuting zones in the sample. But later on in the robustness checks, I relaxed these restrictions and I showed that the results hold. So moving on to methodology, basically, the ideal situation is if I know the municipio of origin of every migrant in the United States, and I then assign them the homicide rate of that municipio, and that would be the treatment variable. However, given that this information is not available in any survey or admin data source, I resort to the second best alternative, which is provided by the Matricula Consular ID cards program. So the Matricula Consular ID card is an official identification that could be used for legal purposes in the US. For instance, for opening a bank account, in some states to obtain a driver's license, or to send money back home. And the card is available is valid for 5 years and then is subject to renewal. The literature shows that almost 38% of US Mexican migrants hold this card. However, the majority of them are undocumented migrants, because if the migrant is documented, they won't need this extra ID card or the benefits of this ID card. Now, crucial for my purposes, the ID card indicates the Mexican municipio of origin of the migrant, as well as the US commuting zone where they live in the US. So the data that I have are total counts of the cards that are issued to all Mexicans in the US at the Mexican municipio and US commuting zone level for every year of the time period. So how I use this data is, first, I compute contemporaneous network weights, and that shows the share of migrants from every source municipio who live in a commuting zone J at year T. So imagining, for instance, the Sacramento commuting zone, I'm able to see, for instance, that 50% of the migrants are from Mexico City, 20% are from Guadalajara, etc. Then using these weights, I move on to construct my main independent variable, which is the homicide shock. And the homicide shock is a continuous yearly exposure, a measure of continuous and yearly exposure of Mexican migrants in every commuting zone in the US to violence that is occurring in their municipios of origin. So to compute that, for every Mexican municipio, I first calculate the network weights, which I just explained, as the share of migrants from municipio M in commuting zone J at year T. I have the homicide rate of that municipio, and then the homicide shock is basically a weighted average of the homicide rate in source municipios of migrants in commuting zone J. So I interact the weight or the share of migrants coming from every municipio with the homicide rate of the municipio. And then in interpretation, the homicide shock could be seen as a homicide rate in the average Mexican municipio of origin of migrants who are in a commuting zone. So if all migrants in a commuting zone come from one municipio of origin, the homicide shock will be identical to the homicide rate of that municipio of origin. Then I can run a very simple OLS regressing the outcomes on the homicide shock. I include commuting zone year fixed effects, and in my preferred specification, I also include years since migration fixed effects. I have individual level control variables such as age, educational attainment, and sex, and some commuting zone level variables in order to account for the fact that in my time period, the immigration enforcement policies were changing a lot in different areas. And there was also the recession. So I control for Bartik style measures flavor demand. If the homicide shock were to be randomly assigned to different commuting zones and at different times, then beta would be providing the causal estimate of the effect of violence in the home source municipio on the outcomes of migrants. However, the location of violence within Mexico is not random. You can imagine that it is correlated with socioeconomic factors. So both migrants and stayers from a certain specific municipio of origin could share the same characteristics, such as socioeconomic status or cultural traits that at the same time impact violence, migration decisions, and integration process. And what this leads to is omitted variable bias. So in order to account for that and different causes of biases, such as reverse causality or simultaneity, I use an IV that exploits plausibly exogenous variation in violence within Mexico. And as I mentioned, the IV will incorporate three different components. The first one exploits the variation in the distribution of migrants' municipal origins across different US commuting zones. And this variation ensues given the fact that due to historical accidents and migratory routes, Mexican migrants from different sources or different municipios end up settling in distinct US destinations. Now, these networks end up lowering migration costs, so they end up persisting over time and increasing the probability that Mexican migrants from the same source municipio will migrate to the same US destinations. So recent location patterns can be highly explained by past migration patterns, and that leads to this variation in the network measure or the share of migrants from every municipio across different US destinations. And this network measure is also incorporated in my endogenous variable. So it is one of the two components of the homicide shock. But in the homicide shock, the network shares are contemporaneous, which could introduce bias given that they might be endogenous, impacted by the homicide rates given the war on drugs. So to address this bias, I fixed the network weights in the IV to their 2006 pre-war value. The second component of the IV is what gives me cross-sectional variation. And here I rely or exploit the pre-war geographic distribution of drug trade organizations between 2004 and 2006. And at that time, there were 5 major DTOs controlling the drug market in Mexico. I show them here in dark blue, so there's considerable geographic variation. And in fact, only 15% of total municipios in Mexico had any drug trade organization presence between 2004 and 2006. Interestingly, the origin and the location of the DTOs goes back to early 20th century Chinese migration. Due to the Chinese Exclusion Act in the US, a lot of Chinese migrants ended up settling in Mexico, and they brought with them the technology for opium production and started some drug trade routes, and these persisted till now. Importantly, municipios that had any drug trade organization presence are the ones that later on disproportionately saw the increase in violence. So before the war on drugs, both municipios with drug trade organizations and without had a fairly parallel trend in homicide rates. However, after 2007, there's this disproportionate increase in municipios with drug trade organizations. And finally, to account for time variation in violence, I use exogenous cocaine supply shocks based in Colombia. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, almost 60% of the profit of drug trade organizations in Colombia originates from cocaine drug trafficking. Importantly, this cocaine is produced in, 60% of drug trade organizations in Mexico profit from, comes from cocaine drug trafficking. But this cocaine comes from mainly Colombia, so it is not produced in Mexico. And 73% of the cocaine that is in the US is actually produced in Colombia. So in Colombia, similar to Mexico, they had their own anti-drug strategies all throughout the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. At the beginning of the 2000s, they were also focused on crop eradication programs that are not effective. And then due to the violence because of the drugs, there was a lot of public scrutiny against the government. So then they changed their strategy and started targeting any manufacturing or transportation of drugs, and that led to more effective cocaine seizures. So here we see that although they had this figure shows the total cocaine that is seized by the coca cultivated land in Colombia, and although it was on an increase and then in a decrease in the first half of the 2000s, after 2007 there is an increase that sustained until 2012. So given that these cocaine seizures became more effective, cocaine supply reaching Mexican drug trade organizations decreased, and that led to a 45% increase in retail price of cocaine in US markets. So given the change in rent opportunities, that led to further increase in drug violence in Mexico as different drug trade organizations were fighting for rent. So there is an increase in violence, especially in municipios that had drug trade organizations. So I put these three elements together. I interact the network share fixed in 2006. That shows the 2006 share of migrants in a commuting zone originating from every source municipio. I interact that with an indicator for the presence of at least one drug trade organization in a municipio before the war on drugs between 2004 and 2006. And then I interact that with the annual amount of cocaine seized by Colombian forces per unit of coca cultivated land in Colombia. And the interaction of these three will basically give the IV for the homicide shock. The IV varies between commuting zones and across years. So the main restriction is that the IV should not be correlated with unobserved factors in a commuting zone that affect the migrant integration in the same period, except through its effect on the homicide shock. So I provide different checks for that in the paper, but for now I will only focus on the most important one, which tests whether the IV is correlated with outcome pre-trends. So to do that, I regress the lagged changes in outcomes between 2000 and 2006 on the change in the IV in the post period, and the results are here. So in the pre-period, there is no effect of the IV on any outcome of migrant integration. Estimates are almost zero with tight confidence intervals. And then in terms of relevance, I check whether the IV is actually predicting the homicide shock in commuting zones. And I add gradually the fixed effects. And here, the IV has a highly significant effect on the homicide shock, and the magnitude of the estimate is large. And I also show that the F statistic is greater than 10. And the Montiel, Olea, and Pfluger effective F statistic is 20.3. So moving on to results, I still have almost 15 minutes, right?
You have close to 5 minutes.
Sorry, I think you froze. 15 or 10?
No, it's 5. Like,
oh, okay.
Yeah, because it's a 40 minutes presentation.
Yes. So the beta gives the percentage point change in outcomes per standard deviation increase in the homicide shock. Now, just to give you a way to interpret the results, between 2006 and 2012, the homicide shock increased from 10 to 50 homicides, and that's roughly 1.66 standard deviations. What I find is when homicide shock increases by a standard deviation, there is almost a 43% increase in naturalization relative to the baseline mean, which is the mean in 2006. And there's also a 29% increase in 29% increase in marriage to U.S. citizens. So here I'm not constricting the nationality of the U.S. citizen. It might be a U.S. born native or an immigrant who naturalized. So then moving on, I explore whether the increase in marriage to U.S. citizen is driven by marriages to U.S. born natives or immigrants. And I find that there is an increase in both, in marriages to U.S. born natives and marriages to naturalized Mexicans, which shows that the characteristic of possessing a citizenship is important. However, the main increase and the highly statistically significant one is an increase in marriage to naturalized Mexicans. So that increases by 1.5 percentage points relative to the baseline mean. It's almost a 40% increase in marriage to naturalized Mexicans. However, I find that there is no effect on human capital accumulation. So the estimates here are in the right, they have the right sign. They show that people are reporting higher language proficiency, but the coefficients are small in magnitude, almost close to zero. And if I check the confidence interval limits, I rule out large changes in these outcomes. The same goes for labor market outcomes. So the coefficients are positive, but very small in magnitude and close to zero. And similar to the previous table, I am able to rule out large changes in employment at both the extensive or the intensive margin. I will skip magnitudes for the sake of time. I do a bunch of robustness checks that we can talk about maybe later in the discussion, but mainly I show that these results are not driven by compositional changes or by the sample that I'm using. In terms of mechanisms, there are four main mechanisms that could be explaining this result. So one is the direct exposure to violence, which I directly rule out at the beginning by the selection of cohort. So my cohort is a group of migrants who were in the US before the war on drugs and were not directly exposed to this violence. So this mechanism is eliminated. Then there are the two channels, the emotional and family channel, which act on the same outcomes in opposite direction. I explained a bit briefly about this at the beginning. So the emotional channel is when migrants are emotionally and altruistically tied to their home country, and then the adverse conditions lead to negative effects on their mental well-being. So that leads to a reduction in their productivity. But at the same time, there's the family channel where migrants have family back home directly impacted by violence. Then they increase their productivity to offset their the financial losses of their family. But since I observed no changes in labor market outcomes, neither at the extensive nor at the intensive margin, then it might be that these two channels are acting in opposite directions to lead to these null effects, or that these channels are not operational altogether. Then I argue that the main mechanism driving the results is a change in return intentions. So Mexican migrants in the US are mostly temporary economic migrants who have the choice whether to stay in the US or return back to Mexico. And violence in Mexico might decrease their willingness to return back home. And I argue that this mechanism is most likely operational, given that both naturalization and marriage to US citizens, which I see increasing, could be a proxy for the desire of the migrants to basically establish permanent residency in the US. And in order to explore this mechanism more, I conduct two heterogeneity analyses, which show that, for instance, the marriage effects are larger among immigrants with the shortest duration in the destination. However, the naturalization effects are concentrated for those who have been in the US for almost 7 to 10 years. So taken together, these effects show that migrants, regardless of their recent migration, are doing destination-specific investments, but depending on what opportunities are available to them at a given time, they choose an option. So for shorter tenure migrants, for instance, they get US citizens, which increases their likelihood of naturalization in the future. But for longer tenure migrants who already have the choice to naturalize, they take that option. I then, to explore this mechanism more, I use data from the Mexican census, and I show that there is a decrease in return migration rates to municipios that have heightened violence. However, due to the limitations of that data, and mainly that it stops in 2010, which misses the years 2011 and 12. These are the years with the maximum violence. The effect is not significant. So to conclude, I provide new evidence of the effects of home country violence on the integration of Mexican migrants in the United States. I find an increase in naturalization or civil integration, as well as an increase to US citizens, which facilitates permanent residency in the US. However, I find no changes in cultural integration if it is proxied by intermarriage rates or economic or human capital integration. And I argue that the main mechanism for these results is a decline in return intentions. Now, the main policy implication for destination countries that are hosting migrants is that economic migrants, my results show that economic migrants attempt to stay in the destination due to home country violence, but still this does not automatically reflect on their other outcomes or human capital accumulation. And that emphasizes the need for integration support for this group that usually is not targeted by policy, especially that integration concerns might increase in the future, given that conflicts persist in the source countries of different migrants who originate from low or middle income nations. So thank you so much. I will stop here so that.
Yeah, that was perfectly on time. Thank you very much, Reem. It was a great and interesting presentation.
Thank you.
And now we are going to have a short discussion by Marion Richard. So Marion, if you want to share your slides.
Sure. So my discussion is 10 minutes or the overall discussion is 10 minutes? Sorry. I guess 10 minutes or a bit less.
You can have a 10 minutes discussion, but if Reem wants to answer something, like if she wants to make some comments at the end of your discussion, like just give some time, okay?
Okay. Yes. Okay. No, but I also don't need the 10 minutes. Okay. So my comments on Reem's paper on the effect of violence in Mexico on return intention and integration of the Mexican migrants located in the US. First of all, thank you, Reem. It was a very pleasant read. The paper is super well written and it's very transparent, how you identify the effect, what's your source of variation, what are the assumptions you make for the identification. So it's very clear to follow. And it's very easy for me to make comments also because I know what you've tested already, what not, and what data sets are available. And the description of the context is also very nice, and you do tons of robustness checks. So that's kind of impressive. So I start with summarizing the paper. So the main research question is how the violence due to the drug of war in Mexico in the municipalities of origin of Mexican migrants affects their social and economic integration in the United States. And so to answer this research question, Reem Zaiour exploits both spatial and temporal variation in the level of insecurity in the municipalities of origin of Mexican migrants. And so she exploits the fact that there is spatial variation in the distribution of this drug trade organization, even before the explosion of the war on drugs. And then she exploits kind of this unexpected shock in an increase in violence due to the launch of the war on drugs by Felipe Calderon in 2006. And so she exploits the fact that there is a big discrepancy in the increase in violence between municipalities that previously had the presence of drug trade organization or those who did not have. And she further used, I will comment more on this later, she already did, another exogenous shock for the increase in violence due to seizure of cocaine in Colombia. And so thanks to this, she identified some very interesting effects of this increase in violence. So mostly on intentions to stay of Mexican migrants. And so what are the ways for them to stay? So there's also an heterogeneous effect. So it goes through naturalization and increased marriage to US citizens. But she also sees that it depends on what are the means available for Mexican migrants to stay. So for those who have been in the US for a while, they can apply for naturalization. For those who have been there for a shorter duration, they would mostly seek to stay in the US through marriage to US citizen. So it's also like these effects are like kind of consistent to what would be expected, what means are available for Mexican migrants. But on the other hand, she finds no effect on labor market or human capital outcomes, or very small effects. And so this paper is a nice contribution to the literature because it focuses on external determinants of integration. So is to say like home country characteristics, and also how this interacts with US policies, so naturalization policies, for example. And so I think that's a very relevant research question because also there is an increase of violence in, as you mentioned, globally, especially in developing countries. And so you might have many migrants that expected their migration to be temporary, and then they have to update their expectation on how long they would stay in destination countries. So it's interesting to see how this affects their perspective of integration. Then it's very nice that you can use like detailed data on the origin of municipality of origin of Mexican migrants, because obviously like Mexico is a huge country, so it's nice to be able to use this variation. And then the identification strategy is new and convincing. So you're based on the shift share instrument that has been very used in the migration literature, but you also like make sure that you have an exogenous increase in violence within your shift share instrument. Some more on this IV. So it combines both spatial and temporal variation. It allows you to avoid concerns of simultaneity or reverse causality or omitted variable bias. And it's very nice, like you really do in detail the validity check, the diagnostic of the IV, using the very recent literature on the shift share instruments that have been put into question, like mostly in the trade literature, but that is also true for the migration literature. And so you pass this diagnostic, actually you pass more than what would be required, because you both have no pre-trend in comparing migrants from municipalities with DTO and non-DTO, but you also on top of this exploit an exogenous shock in increasing violence temporarily due to seizure of cocaine in Colombia. So I think this identification is very robust and very convincing, and you're very detailed in your assessment of it. Then I had a smaller comment on the selection, the composition effects of these homicide shocks. So you avoid composition effect in the sense that you only consider migrants that were already present in the US before the increase in violence in 2006. But then I think you would still have some selection because more migrants would stay. You yourself show that there is less return migration, so you have a larger pool of migrants that are still there. So still you show that there is no big differences in their characteristics, and you control for observable characteristics. So I don't think this would be a big concern, this composition effect of migrants remained, but maybe you could still check whether this composition effect is different for maybe migrants who are in the US for shorter periods. Maybe there is less selection there because they would have stayed 2 to 3 years anyway. So maybe when you look at migrants who stay for a longer period, that there is more this selection of people who stay because they face adverse conditions in their country of origin. But that's just an idea. Then I had a question regarding the timing of your effects. So my understanding is that you look at simultaneous effects, immediate effects somehow, of increase in violence in municipality of origin on your outcomes. And I was wondering if maybe you could look at previous periods so that to leave time kind of for this outcome to materialize. So maybe education outcome, years of education or language proficiency, maybe it's hard like in the same year that you immediately see an effect. So maybe also using some, I don't know if you have other outcomes like enroll at schools that maybe might react in a shorter time span, or also looking at effect of violence in T-1 or T-2 going into previous periods. I don't know if, I'm not sure if it's possible with the data you have, I think so, but yeah. Then I had a question on another potential mechanism. So your instrument is very similar to what has been used in the literature, like on shift chair instruments. Then, okay, there is controversy in the literature on whether, an inflow of migrants would affect the employment labor market outcomes of previous migrants, but it's a possibility. And there is also a possibility that this violence, so I also don't know the exact consensus in the literature of violence as a push factor, but it's also a possibility that you have then more inflows of migrants in these municipalities that had previously like a large share of migrants from these municipalities of origin. And that might affect then the labor market outcomes through another channel of the previous migrants in these municipalities. So you control for labor market conditions with the Bartik instrument, but because it's a Bartik instrument, I think it would not capture, it's a sectoral thing, it would not capture this effect due to increase in migration inflows. So I was wondering if you could directly check whether there is like a higher share of Mexican migrants in these US commuting zones that are more affected by your homicide rate shock. Directly, the same way you look at your sample composition. And then if also maybe you do a very nice placebo check using Central American migrants, looking at the marriage outcomes. So you would expect, as you showed, that whether there is violence in Central America should not affect the marriage decision of Mexican migrants in the US. But maybe it would affect their labor market outcome through the same mechanism of competition on the labor markets. So that would be interesting to look. That's just a suggestion. Okay, and that's the end of my comments. Thank you again. Very interesting paper.
Thank you very much, Mariam, for the discussion. Now, if Reem wants to give a short reply or make any comments on what Mariam said, you're free to do it.
Thank you so much, Mariam. That's very nice comments. And the idea of the last idea of the Central Americans on labor market outcomes, that's a great idea that I haven't thought of before. So I can definitely do that. In terms of the effect, so I wasn't very concerned that the competition channel is there just because I find a decrease in migration due to violence. And the effect of violence on migration in general, there's a lot of papers on that, and each paper finds a different effect depending on the data they are using. But when I use the ACS data, I find this decrease in migration from Mexico to the US commuting zones. So I was not very concerned that there is this competition channel where there's more Mexican migrants that are now competing for jobs with the previous migrants or with other ones. The selection effects, I do have, I think I tried at some point the effect on the composition of those recent migrants, and there was also no effect. So I just focus for now on the effect on the sample, on the composition of the sample that I use. But when I looked at other samples, there was also no change in this compositional characteristics. And for the last comment, the timing of the effects, that's something I'm always thinking about. Because given that labor market outcomes and human capital accumulation, specifically the latter, takes time to materialize, I was just trying to think to the best way to capture that, given that I'm using the IV. So if I put the lags and there's serial correlation among these, and that's the main problem that I'm facing with that exercise. But I agree that I can do some long run or long difference analysis that would capture when these outcomes could start materializing. And that is on my to-do list. Yeah. Thank you so much, though. These are great comments.
Thank you to both of you. Now, there is one question in the chat, so let me read it for you. Andres Ramasco is asking if you can observe the ethnicity of the spouse in the married to U.S. citizen variable.
Yeah, I can observe if they are Hispanic or not, but um, I didn't do any analysis with that because in the ACS data, so if an individual is Mexican born, they are directly coded as Hispanic. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, he was probably think like, I mean, I was thinking when I read the question that maybe it could be possible that a Mexican migrant goes to the US, gets the US citizenship, and then later he marries another Mexican migrant that came later, no?
Right.
So because you are using that variable as to measure the cultural integration, no? Like,
So marriage to US citizens is more return intentions, but once I see the nationality of the spouse, that's where cultural integration comes from. If they are marrying someone from the same country of origin or a US born native, for instance, that's what the literature uses when they are using intermarriage rates as a measure of cultural or social integration.
okay. Yeah, so Andres is saying that what he had in mind is that getting married to a person of other ethnicity might be a better proxy for integration.
I can definitely so move on from the nationality of the spouse to their I can definitely try that. For now, I was just assuming so if a Mexican is marrying another Mexican, then they are marrying, for instance, a Hispanic individual. And then I have the other outcome, which is marriage to foreign-born migrant that is not Mexican, and I don't see any effects on that.
Okay. And then we have another question that is by Sarah Perlman. She's asking, did you limit the analysis to those who have not moved in the past year in the ACS? Because this seems to be the only way to deal with movers.
Yeah, I only focus on migrants who migrated between 2000 and 2006, so before the war on drugs, and then my analysis period starts between 2006 and 2012. So migrants in my cohort have spent a minimum of a year to a maximum of 13 years in the US.
And then she's also asking if, like, she says that she's worried about them moving within the US.
Yes, so I do have a check that looks at the effect of the homicide shock on internal migration within US states and across the different US states, but I don't see any effect on that. I think there was another question that I missed from Sarah. It just, I think, disappeared to...
You can check the research.
Yeah, oh, sorry, about the marriage to non-citizen Mexican born. She was asking if that is the thing that did not change.
what did not
didn't-
change? Yeah, what did not change is marriage to... So marriage to Mexican-born increases, specifically marriage to citizen Mexican-born, that's large and highly significant. But marriage to other immigrants who are not Mexican, even if they are naturalized, did not change.
Well, at this point, I think that maybe we can close the seminar, and then if someone else has another question, we can keep ask. Okay, so Sarah Pellman has one last question. Let's finish this. She's also curious about the marriage to non-citizen Mexicans.
Thank you, Sarah. No, I have not done that, but that's on my to-do list as well. I anticipate that given that the effect on marriage to Mexicans is positive and the marriage to citizen Mexicans is the one that is significant, then maybe the marriage to non-citizen Mexicans might be decreasing or just not significant. But that is also on my to-do list.